Tonight, I want to start with something that does not look dramatic at first. No explosions, no tanks, no sirens, just a meeting room in Brussels in early 2022, long tables, stacks of briefing papers, diplomats staring at screens showing satellite images of Russian troops massed on Ukraine's border. For weeks, those images had been dismissed as posturing, exercises, pressure tactics, negotiating leverage, until suddenly they weren't. They were preparation. And in that moment, before the first missile ever left a launcher, the world crossed into a new era, because what Vladimir Putin was about to do would not just invade a country, it would fracture a system. For 3 decades after the Cold War, global politics operated on a fragile assumption that major powers would compete, yes, but within boundaries. Borders would be contested diplomatically. Influence would be fought over economically. But large-scale conquest in Europe was finished. Putin shattered that assumption, and when he did, every nation watching had to recalculate. Who is safe? Who is next? Who can be trusted? Who will act? This is not just Ukraine's war. It is the beginning of a global realignment. When Russian forces crossed into Ukraine, they were not just attacking Kyiv. They were challenging the architecture built after 1945, the United Nations, the Helsinki Accords, the idea that sovereignty is protected by law, not force. And if that challenge succeeded, everything else would wobble. So the response was immediate. The United States rallied allies. Europe broke taboos. Germany rearmed. Japan reconsidered pacifism. Finland and Sweden abandoned neutrality. Defense budgets surged. Arms industries expanded. Security became the organizing principle of politics again. A language many thought was obsolete returned. Deterrence. Containment, spheres of influence, proxy conflict. Suddenly, it felt familiar, uncomfortably familiar, a new Cold War, but not identical to the last. This one is multipolar, messy, technological, economic, and global. Russia, isolated from the West, pivoted toward China, energy flowed east, trade rerouted, diplomacy coordinated, not as allies in ideology, as partners of convenience. Beijing watched Ukraine closely, not just for Russia's sake, for Taiwan's, for its own future calculations. What happens when force meets resistance? What happens when sanctions follow? What happens when democracies coordinate? Ukraine became a case study, so did Russia's mistakes. Meanwhile, countries in the global South navigated carefully. They did not see a simple morality play. They saw energy prices rise, food supplies disrupted, fertilizer shortages, debt pressure. For them, this war was not about NATO, it was about survival. And they resented being asked to choose sides, so they hedged, traded with Russia, worked with the West, balanced a world less aligned, more transactional, more unstable. At the same time, international institutions strained, the UN Security Council was paralyzed, the World Trade Organization weakened, arms control treaties collapsed, norms eroded. When great powers violate rules without consequence, rules weaken. And when rules weaken, risk grows. Look at defense spending. In Europe, it surged to levels unseen since the 1980s. In Asia, it followed. In the Middle East, it accelerated. Every region watched Ukraine and learned the same lesson: prepare now, not later. This is how arms races begin, not with speeches, with spreadsheets, procurement plans, 10-year projections, quiet fear. And then there is technology, drones, cyber warfare, AI targeting, satellite surveillance, electronic jamming. Ukraine has become the most technologically observed battlefield in history. Every innovation is studied, copied, refined, exported. Wars are laboratories, and the next conflicts will reflect this one, which means Ukraine's suffering is shaping future wars. That is a heavy burden. For Ukrainians, this global shift is abstract. What is real is survival, blackouts, funerals, rebuilding. They fight not to be a symbol, but they have become one of resistance, of alignment, of what happens when a small nation refuses to disappear. And for Russia, the pivot away from Europe is permanent. Trust is broken, markets lost, reputation damaged, a Eurasian power turning inward, dependent on fewer partners, less flexible, more brittle. Putin sought leverage. He achieved dependency. For the West, unity has been renewed. But unity requires maintenance. Elections loom, populism rises, attention shifts, support wavers. The danger is not collapse, it is drift, slow disengagement, strategic fatigue, and adversaries wait for that. This is what long wars do. They test systems, not just armies. They reward patience, punish distraction, and redefine priorities. We are watching that happen in real time, not in headlines, in budgets, in alliances, in trade routes, in doctrines. The world before February 2022 is gone. It is not coming back. We are living in the after, and the question is not whether there will be consequences. The question is whether they will be managed or stumble into something worse, because history rarely repeats exactly, but it does rhyme. And right now, the echoes are getting louder. If Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a shock to Europe, it was a warning shot to Asia. Because from the first hours of this war, in offices thousands of miles from Kyiv, Chinese military planners, intelligence analysts, and political strategists were watching with extraordinary attention. Not casually, not diplomatically, clinically, they were studying every convoy, every missile strike, every sanctions package, every speech in Washington, every vote in Congress, every hesitation in Europe. Because for Beijing, Ukraine was never only about Russia, it was about Taiwan, it was about timing, it was about risk, it was about whether force could succeed in the modern world and whether the price of failure was survivable. For decades, China's position on Taiwan has been clear. It considers the island part of its territory and reserves the right to use force to bring it under Beijing's control. At the same time, Taiwan has built a vibrant democracy, deep economic ties with the West, and a sophisticated technology sector that sits at the center of the global semiconductor industry. That contradiction has defined East Asian security for generations. Strategic ambiguity, deterrence without explicit guarantees, peace through uncertainty. Ukraine changed that calculus because Ukraine showed what happens when ambiguity meets aggression. Russia believed the West would hesitate. It was wrong. China noticed. Before 2022, many analysts assumed Beijing would be cautious about large-scale conflict. China's economic integration with the world, its reliance on exports, its massive foreign reserves, these were seen as stabilizers. Ukraine complicated that. Russia lost access to Western markets and survived, imperfectly, painfully, but survived. That matters. It suggests sanctions are costly, but not fatal. Beijing took notes. At the same time, Ukraine demonstrated how smaller states can resist larger ones with the right preparation, dispersed defenses, civilian resilience, international support, information transparency. Taiwan has studied this closely. Its military doctrine has shifted further toward porcupine strategy, making invasion prohibitively expensive. Mobile missile systems, hardened facilities, decentralized command, civil defense training, stockpiling. The goal is not to defeat China, it is to make conquest unbearable. Ukraine proved this can work, but Ukraine also revealed limits. Air superiority matters. Naval control matters, supply lines matter. Taiwan's island geography is both shield and vulnerability. Unlike Ukraine, it cannot receive aid over land. Everything must come by sea or air, which makes blockades a central scenario. China learned from Russia's logistical failures. Amphibious planning intensified. Joint operations expanded, exercises became more complex, missile deployments increased. The People's Liberation Army began rehearsing encirclement, not invasion first, isolation first, cut power, cut trade, cut communication, squeeze, then negotiate or force surrender. Ukraine taught Beijing that outright blitzkrieg is risky. Gradual coercion may be safer. At the same time, China observed Western unity. This surprised many in Beijing. Europe did not fracture. NATO expanded, Japan rearmed, South Korea cooperated, Australia deepened ties, the Quad strengthened, a network emerged. China does not face one adversary, it faces an ecosystem. Ukraine accelerated that. Defense coordination in Asia intensified. U.S. bases expanded. Philippines agreements revived. Japan revised its constitution. India recalibrated. Deterrence thickened. For Beijing, this raises the cost of action. But it also increases pressure. Nationalism matters in China. So does legitimacy. The Communist Party derives authority from stability and growth. A Taiwan crisis risks both, yet backing down carries its own risks. Ukraine demonstrated how quickly territorial disputes become identity struggles. Once framed as destiny, retreat becomes humiliation. Xi Jinping is watching this carefully. Putin's difficulties are instructive: overconfidence, underestimating resistance, ignoring alliances, misreading economic resilience. Xi is not Putin. China's system is more institutionalized, more technocratic, more data-driven, but no system is immune to hubris, especially one that suppresses dissent. Ukraine exposed how autocracies can become trapped in their own narratives. Bad news doesn't travel upward. Optimism is rewarded. Caution is punished. Reality arrives too late. That is a universal risk, Taiwan also learned. Its society has invested in preparedness. Cyber resilience, emergency training, infrastructure hardening, public awareness campaigns, disaster readiness, defense as civic duty. Like Ukraine, it is weaving security into daily life, not militarization, normalization. And there is another lesson. Leadership matters. Zelensky's decision to stay transformed the war. It personalized resistance. It mobilized support. It humanized the conflict. Taiwan's leaders understand this. Visibility, credibility, presence, these are strategic assets. China's leadership style is different, more opaque, more centralized, less personal. That may limit flexibility in crisis. Internationally, Ukraine changed expectations. If China moves on Taiwan, the response will be compared to Ukraine. Sanctions packages are already modeled, supply chain contingencies planned, financial isolation scenarios prepared. No one will be improvising. That increases deterrence, but also reduces room for de-escalation because everyone has scripts, and scripts can become traps. Another lesson: time matters. Russia attacked when it believed Ukraine was weak. It was wrong. China watches Taiwan's military modernization closely. If Beijing believes its window is closing, incentives shift. So deterrence must be credible continuously, not episodically. That requires sustained political will, which is difficult in democracies. Election cycles intervene, priorities change, fatigue sets in. Ukraine has shown both the power and fragility of democratic coalitions. China is betting on fatigue. So is Russia. They are patient. They think in decades. They assume democracies think in quarters. Whether that assumption holds will shape the future, because Taiwan is not just about China and the United States. It is about technology. Semiconductors, supply chains, economic dominance, artificial intelligence, modern economies run on Taiwanese chips. A conflict there would be global, immediate, devastating. Ukraine disrupted grain markets. Taiwan would disrupt everything, and that reality restrains everyone so far. Ukraine has not made war in Asia inevitable. It has made it more calculated, more studied, more dangerous, because everyone now knows what war costs and what it requires. For now, deterrence holds, but it is under strain. Every exercise, every speech, every election, every crisis feeds into the calculus, and Ukraine remains the reference point, a living laboratory of modern conflict, a warning, a manual, a mirror. And as long as it continues, Beijing and Taipei will keep watching, learning, preparing, adjusting, because the next great test of this era may not be in Europe. It may be across a narrow strait. For years before Russian tanks crossed into Ukraine, NATO had an identity problem. It was the most powerful military alliance in history, and it was searching for a mission. After the Cold War ended, NATO did not dissolve. It expanded eastward, quietly, steadily. Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, then later the Balkans. Each enlargement was controversial. Each was framed by Moscow as provocation. Each was defended by NATO as voluntary, but beneath the diplomacy, something else was happening. The alliance was drifting. Without a clear existential threat, unity weakened, defense budgets shrank, public interest faded, leaders questioned relevance. In 2019, France's president called NATO brain dead. In the United States, Donald Trump openly questioned Article 5. Alliances, he suggested, were optional. Russia watched and learned. From Moscow's perspective, NATO looked divided, politicized, complacent, unprepared. Putin believed he could exploit that. Ukraine was meant to prove it. Instead, it revived NATO. In February 2022, something extraordinary happened. Countries that had disagreed for years agreed. Sanctions passed unanimously, forces mobilized, battle groups deployed, defense plans activated. NATO shifted from reassurance to deterrence, from training missions to frontline defense. Within weeks, troops were moving east. thousands of them, to Poland, to Romania, to the Baltics, to Slovakia. Forward presence became forward posture, permanent, visible, serious. The alliance dusted off contingency plans that had not been used in decades. War games were upgraded, command structures streamlined, logistics networks rebuilt, rail corridors mapped, ports modernized, fuel reserves expanded. This was institutional memory returning, a Cold War machine rebooted but updated with cyber commands, space monitoring, drone integration, AI analysis, a 21st century alliance responding to a 20th century threat, and then came the shock: Finland and Sweden. For generations, they had defined themselves by neutrality. It was not weakness.